You're listening to the REI Marketing Nerds podcast, the leading resource for real estate investors who want to dominate their market online. Dan Barrett is the founder of AdWords Nerds, a high-tech digital agency focusing exclusively on helping real estate investors like you get more leads and deals online, outsmart your competition, and live a freer, more awesome life. And now, your host, Dan Barrett.
All right, hello and welcome to this week's episode of the REI Marketing Nerds podcast. As always, this is Daniel Barrett here from AdWordsNerds.com, where you can go to find more leads and deals for your real estate investing business using the wonderful magic of Google Ads, Facebook ads, SEO, and more. You can go find that at AdWordsNerds.com. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I've got so I've done a lot of interviews on this show. And you've heard me say many times before, I'm really excited for this, for you to hear this interview. I think you're getting a lot of value out of it. And sometimes I'll even say this interview is wide ranging. But this, folks, I think is literally the most wide ranging interview I have ever done, because this week I'm interviewing Frank McKinney. Now, if you do not know Frank, I highly recommend that you go over to his website, which is frank-mckinney.com, or you can Google Frank McKinney, he'll come up, and you can see why they call him a real estate artist. And if you're a little bit like me, I kind of rolled my eyes at that initially, because I was like, okay, I get it, real estate artist, okay. But folks, Frank is unlike any other real estate investor I have ever met. He is over the top. He is ambitious. He is flamboyant. He is deeply concerned with the aesthetic value of the work that he does. He is doing nonprofits. He is a best-selling author. He is so many things. It is truly hard to wrap your mind around. And Frank is one of those people where I didn't know what I was going to get when I started the interview. And I ended up just being totally charmed by this really incredible and unique person. So I'm super excited for you to hear my interview with Frank McKinney. Like I said, go check out his website, frank-mckinney.com. And let's jump straight into it. Frank, welcome to the show, my friend. Very happy to have you here.
I tell you what, I've been following your show for a while. I've been on an Oprah. I've been on the cover of USA Today 2020, but I've never been on your podcast. So this is something that I put at the top of my list. I can't wait to let you drive this bus for the next half hour.
All right, man. Well, that means a lot to me. I very much appreciate it. And we were kind of talking a little bit before we hit record that there's like a million places this conversation can go. I will say, people love to throw around the term Renaissance man. They love to say that. You are legitimately a Renaissance man in the sense of there's a million things we could talk about. So before we follow this wherever it's going to go, for people who don't know you, aren't familiar with your work, how do you answer the question, what do you do? If you're at a cocktail party and they're like, oh, hey, Frank, what do you do? How do you answer that question?
It's really tough. I start out by saying, I'm a Christian, and we hear this saying often, I'm a sinner saved by the grace of God. No, I'm a saint who has been saved by the grace of God, who still sins. That might disarm them for a minute. But how do you make money on that, Frank? Well, I'm a corn-fed country boy from Indiana. I grew up on a farm. I'm the oldest of 6. I went to 4 high schools in 4 years. I spent 7 different stints in juvenile detention. I took a one-way plane ticket and plane ride out of Indiana when I was 18 with a $50 bill and everything I could fit in a backpack, because I was causing my beautiful mother to turn prematurely gray. I was kind of ruining the family. They needed to get me out of Indiana. I landed in Palm Beach, lifestyles of the rich and famous. And I don't believe in the welfare mentality. I might believe in the welfare system. That's fine. Entitlement systems they have an intended purpose, but the entitlement mentality is very toxic. So I was proud to have a job earning $180 a week as a maintenance worker on a golf course. I then became a tennis instructor after that. I was earning $100,000 a year as a 21-year-old teaching tennis. I bought a Ferrari just for my tennis teaching days. I don't say that to impress anybody, but to impress upon them that there was life after juvenile detention. I went from that to, teaching tennis. I earned my PhD in entrepreneurship and my master's in real estate. In that, I taught people who would drive up to their lessons in Ferraris and Lamborghinis and have the mansions and the yachts. And they had the Beyonce lookalike wife, and they had everything I wanted for you young people. Imagine MTV Cribs. For you people my age, it's Lifestyles of Rich and Famous with Robin Leach. And they taught me that the way they were able to live the lifestyle they were living was real estate. They were not born real estate investors. They were doctors, lawyers, inventors, but they took the discretionary income they had left over and invested in real estate. So the long answer to your short question is I became a real estate artist. And that was a moniker that was given to me by Fortune magazine back in the late 90s. He might look like he can sing or play an instrument or sculpt or paint, but what he builds is three-dimensional art on a sun-drenched canvas known as the Atlantic Ocean. And I ran with it. And so that's what I have done. No, I didn't start that way, Dan. I started by flipping crack houses before flip was even a word. Flip was a word used in gymnastics. It wasn't even a word used in real estate back in the late 80s. And I went from flipping hundreds of little crack houses to building now 44 direct oceanfront homes on speculation, meaning I don't have a buyer in mind when I put a shovel in the ground, with an average selling price of $14 million. And aside from that, I'm a soon to be nine-time best-selling author in 7 different genres. So that's kind of I love writing. I would have had a 0.8 GPA instead of a 1.8 GPA out of high school had it not been for my ability to write. And then as a hobby, I'm an ultramarathon runner. I run races over 100 miles in length. I've run the toughest foot race in the world according to National Geographic, the Badwater Ultramarathon, 12 times. So that's how I would answer it if you gave me that much time at a cocktail party.
Well, all right. So we were talking before we hit record, and we were like, oh, we'll just kind of free associate wherever the conversation's going to go. So there's like a million things I want to ask about that entire journey. I want to start a little bit just by picking at something that was in the beginning, which is this scene of you getting on a plane from Indiana to California, $50 in a backpack. And I want to ask about that moment, right? Because I think, look, my family are all from South Bend, right? So they're all from Indiana. They're all Indiana folk. And Indiana's great. Nothing wrong with it, right? But it strikes me that there are a lot of people that probably felt like you did, which is, I want to get out of here, and then never did, right? So there's something going on in that moment where you're like, I am willing to take a leap, get on the plane, leave with only a bag. Can you walk me through, like, why do you think you made that decision instead of, well, I'm just going to make the most of it here? Like, what?
So first, it was Florida, not California, but.
Oh, Florida. I'm sorry. Yeah, Palm Beach, you said. That's right. Okay.
And there's a reason why it was Florida. So the short answer is it wasn't a choice. The choice was made for me. I just come out of juvenile detention. I just got kicked out of a boarding school in Colorado for troubled youth. I mean, my parents were at their wits' end. So they said, we think it's a good idea that you go to Florida and we might be able to help you get a job as a maintenance worker on a golf course. And we had just vacationed in Florida, by the way, like 2 weeks before, and I had run away while I was on vacation. Like, I wanted to be there. It was warm. There was beaches. There was girls that did look like farm hands. Yeah. No knock on Indiana. I love Indiana, believe me. But when I left Indiana, Dan, it wasn't a place. I mean, it was not what it is today. I'm very proud of my roots, but I wasn't happy to be living there in the mid 80s. So that decision was made for me. I remember kicking my backpack or my little duffel bag along as we were in the line. There was no TSA back then, but in the line to get on the plane. Like, I really didn't want to go. I was being forced, just like I got forced to go to boarding school. But the only kind of silver lining was that golden lining, which was the sun that I was looking forward to getting back to. This was January. I remember when I left.
Oh, yeah.
So let me pick up where I left off. When I get to Florida, there was a girl I had met there. It was all going to be fine. I'll have this little job digging sand traps on a golf course, and I'm just going to live kind of this vacation lifestyle. I never went back home. I go back home to visit. I go to the Indy 500 every year. But I think my parents thought I would be shocked into like scared straight, and I would go to a community college. And it just, Florida is the land of opportunity, and it happened for me. It greater than I could have ever imagined. And I don't think it could have happened anywhere else but Florida.
Well, you mentioned, too, that you ended up getting this job teaching tennis and making $100K a year, which is insanely good money considering the time and what you were doing. How did you handle that transition? Because it strikes me almost as like there's a lot of people who, when they make money for the first time, really go off the rails. Yeah. So, like, what was that like? Were you like immediately thinking like, okay, how do I turn this into business and investing, and how do I grow this? Or was there like a learning period where you were kind of just shocked to have it at all? What was that experience like?
Yeah, remember 1.8 GPA. So I'm a simpleton. I'm a linear thinker. I'm not very bright. I went off the rails. Of course I did. I didn't know what I was doing. There's nothing extraordinary about coming to Florida with a $50 bill and a one-way plane ticket. It's what happened after I hit the land of Oz, the land of opportunity. And I started making that kind of money. Now, what was off the rails was buying a Ferrari. That was ridiculous. It was basically everything I had saved. I could have used it for something else. And ultimately, I did sell that car when it was time to buy my first crack house. And I used the proceeds and some of the money I saved baking out there in the hot sun teaching tennis to buy that first crack house. It was the epiphanous moment. I knew I was an entrepreneur back in Indiana when it would snow and it would be like an ice storm. There'd be a steep hill, and me and my buddies would go to the bottom of the hill. When the cars couldn't get up to the top, we would help push them up, and we would wait for like $5 to be handed out the window. I made a living pushing cars up a hill.
Yeah.
And then in Florida, there were some of these people when I was a maintenance worker that, hey, your car looks a little dirty. Can I wash it? And they would give me the keys. I would literally take it to the car wash. Yeah. Let the car wash do the work, and they pay me $20. And the car wash cost me $5. So I knew I was an entrepreneur then, but really where the light bulb went off was when I came off that as a maintenance worker, came off that golf course, became a tennis instructor, and saw the lifestyle that the people were living that I was teaching tennis to. And in that moment, I realized there was a limit, and the limit was about $100,000 a year. I mean, I have friends that are still tennis pros 40 years later that are making maybe $150,000 a year. And I thought, if only I could get inside their minds and ask them the question, how did you get here? The problem, Dan, was they were 78 feet on the other side of the net, paying me $50 an hour. And I had eight of them lined up for 8 hours in a row, almost every single day. Yeah. Hence the money. You can do the math. That's $400 a day times, 300 days a year, 250 days a year. It's $100,000.
Yeah.
So I came up with this conspiracy. It's in my very first book. It came out about 20 years ago. That I would, if you were my tennis student and you were, Mr. Big Bucks and fancy car and beautiful wife and mansion and yacht, you'd pay me for an hour, but I'd tire you out after 45 minutes. I made sure you couldn't finish.
Oh.
And I just was dying to get in your head, Dan. And I did that for 2 years. I won't say hundreds, but to dozens of tennis students. And that's where I earned my PhD in entrepreneurship and my master's in real estate, picking their brains 15 minutes at a time while I brought them a cold towel and, a cold drink and a towel. And that was when I said, oh my gosh, if you're living this way because of the money left over after you pay taxes and buy groceries and, pay for your house, you're making this in this thing called real estate.
Oh.
And they taught me that was the way to go. And a few in particular said you should try the distressed real estate market. Of course, that's all I could afford. And I bought a crack house. My first crack house I bought was in 1986 for $36,000. And from there, we did a bunch of those. Mind you, there was a 5-year learning curve in the business of real estate. Malcolm Gladwell references to be an expert at anything, you got to put in 10,000 hours. Well, 10,000 hours, if you do the math, is 5 years. And I became an expert at the craft of real estate, not the business, the craft of real estate. Meaning, sacrifice, build your reputation first, and the bottom line will follow. Focus on your ROR, return on reputation, and your ROI will follow. So my margins were compressed at the beginning because my crack houses were over improved. I mean, they were 3 coats of paint, $25 yard carpet, brand new roof instead of patching the hole on it, grass sod instead of grass seed. These were nice, and they sold for 103% of retail. That's where I got a taste of being a real estate artist. Did hundreds of those transactions for 5 years, and then, Dan, I didn't do a house worth more than $100,000 for 5 years, and I jumped from $100,000 to $2.2 million. Because I had become the expert at the craft. It was no longer a significant risk to me. Like the biggest risk I ever took, like a muscle, exercising your risk tolerance like a muscle, was coming off that tennis court and leaving a $100,000 a year job behind. It wasn't a big jump for me to go. And by the way, my margins went from 7% to 25% on $100,000 houses. So the craft, my expertise at the craft was getting better, but to jump to 2.2 million was not a big jump at all.
And you that jump that you're talking about from the $100,000 house to the $2.2 million house, essentially what you're saying is the reason you were able to make that jump, it's almost like even when you were working on the $100,000 house, you were treating it like it was a $2.2 million house? Is that like you were developing a personal style? Like what made the jump possible?
I'll tell you how it works. So I was perfectly happy doing $100,000 houses. I never had like these big dreams to do oceanfront homes.
Yeah.
I was happy being a tennis pro until I learned there was another life. I was happy doing craft houses until I realized I was really good at this craft. When I say craft, it's like if Van Gogh, Renoir, or Monet went to a paint store and had to buy a palette and a brush and paint. Would they buy the cheapest paint? They didn't. They bought the best canvas. They bought the best paint. They didn't cut corners. And I didn't do that early in my career. And at that price point, it's all about the bottom line. It's all about taking that spreadsheet and sees what falls and maximizes what falls to the bottom line. I was maximizing what fell to the bottom line of my reputation. That was my focus. And I found out later that the return on investment would follow. So the jump really, it's almost like the application I used in the last year of my $100,000 career with $100,000 houses. You put that application in an envelope and you mail it. It's delivered by the same 37-cent stamp or 39, whatever stamps are nowadays, 42-cent stamp. It doesn't matter the price point. What matters was me getting over any fear associated with the thought of taking that kind of risk. It's not the risk itself that makes you afraid. It's the thought of taking the risk and realizing that it didn't matter. It was just another zero. Listen, if I was buying a house for 75 grand and putting a coat of paint on it and flipping it for 100, what's the difference between buying a house for 750 grand, putting $250,000 into it and putting a $2 million price point on it?
Yeah.
That's how I saw it. And there wasn't, I mean, I'm afraid every day of my life. Let me quantify that or clarify that or state that. I just don't let fear stop me. Actually, I know when I'm afraid, I'm feeling the sensation of fear. It's always associated with the thought of taking a big risk associated with a big change or challenge, financial, spiritual, relational, dietary, what have you. And so I exercise that risk. My muscle is really small, but my risk tolerance is really strong.
Yeah.
And eventually it became stronger and could withstand greater pressure.
Want to find motivated seller leads online, but don't know where to start? Download our free Motivated Seller Keyword Report today. AdWords nerds have spent over $5 million this year researching the most profitable keywords for finding motivated seller leads. And you can grab these exact keywords when you download our report at www.adwordsnerds.com/keywords.
Well, let me transition there because we started talking about ocean, you mentioned your oceanfront properties and stuff. And I really encourage people, if you haven't been to the websites, Frank-McKinney.com, and we'll have the links to it, but you can also Google it, you'll find it. And you can go on their website and you can check out some of the properties that Frank works on, these kind of like oceanfront, really beautiful properties. You mentioned earlier that, you were kind of called this real estate artist. And it did really strike me that you clearly have a point of view about what you're doing that is beyond what I think most investors have, right? There's clearly something you're trying to do with the properties that you work on. And I would love to kind of just dig on how you think about the term art when applied to what you do. Is what you do in art, and like, how do you approach it? Did you approach a property like any other investor? Are you thinking about it from an aesthetic point of view? Or I'd love some insight into what your process is there.
So we're going to bounce around a little bit, but let's start with I see so many real estate investors. Matter of fact, in a week, I'm talking to a big real estate investment club. I've talked to hundreds of them across the country. Most investors are bottom line driven. Okay, listen, I'm a businessman first and an artist a distant second, but I take an artist approach to the endeavor that I might be contemplating, meaning I can toggle back and forth. I've trained myself to toggle back and forth between right brain and left brain in nanoseconds. And that's something that we don't have time to get into how to learn to do that. But I want you to understand that if you've been told you're a left brainer, which is a spreadsheeter, a non-creative, a business-minded person, your whole life, you've been told that. I guarantee you've been told you're one or the other. That's not true. My father was a banker. My grandfather was a banker. So I was left brain dominant. I was all a statistical, analytical, spreadsheet kind of mind. It took me a decade to wake up the right side of my brain. So I could then toggle back and forth between, okay, I want to build a house on the ocean that has countertops that are 14,000 years old, lava countertops from France. And I want to walk, when I walk in the front door, I want to walk on water, meaning I'm going to put in glass that's as thick as your teller, drive-through teller glass. That's the artist side. Then I would quickly toggle back to the spreadsheet side, make sure it made sense.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the view of real estate, and even from $100,000 investor to my biggest, most expensive house was a $50 million spec. Starting with a $50 million spec, Dan, there's 50,000 people in the world out of a population of 8 billion that can afford what I do for a living. How often do you see at an auction a painting from Van Gogh, Renoir, Monet going for tens of millions of dollars? Because they were the artists. They approached what they did with their craft with a way that none of the other starving artists did. And I didn't want to be a starving artist. I wanted to be a Van Gogh, Renoir, Monet. So part of the branding and part of the approach to set myself apart first and then attract the 50,000 out of 8 billion was there was a method to the madness. I took that same approach to a $100,000 house. And let me just dumb it down. I did over improve. I did make it the nicest on the block. I did market it. Now, maybe back then I'm wearing a pink gorilla outfit. I'm, jumping up and down with an open house sign and putting Mylar balloons on the chimney. But I still, listen, to this day, if you go to our website, which by the way, PC Magazine calls Disney on a desktop. So there's something there for everybody. You will see our grand unveilings are very theatrical. I've jumped a motorcycle over a house. I've rappelled out of a helicopter over a house. I've come off the back of a flaming jet ski. We took a veil, like a piece of art, and veiled an entire house once. They're very theatrical. The reason that we do this is because I want the real estate brokers and the VIPs that are invited to pick up their phone and say, yeah, I don't know about this guy pretending like he's Blackbeard, rappelling down a zip line from one guest house to the other. It's kind of a neat show. It belongs on a back lot of Vegas, or maybe not even at all on Broadway. But you got to see the house. Right. So, Dan, I'm the opening act for what you are. You don't buy me. You don't buy my purple hair. You don't buy my funny clothes. You buy the house. And if I can get you there, step the hell out of the way and let that front door open, that's where I've made my living. And people, they totally lose sight of like, you won't hear me use the word, the business of real estate. No, it's the craft. Become an expert at the craft of real estate, and your margins will handsomely reward you.
So was the lesson that you kind of took and you've kind of applied over time, right? It seems like twofold where you're getting at there. First is like, one, you just like you said, you treat what you do as a craft. You treat it as a craftsman, someone who cares a great deal about the quality of the work that you do and the impact it's going to have on people, right? Like I was really struck by, you said, you walk in and you're walking on water, right? There's an aesthetic moment that you're trying to create that people really remember. But you also understood, it sounds like very young or very early, I should say, that if you can't get anyone to look at it, it's not going to matter. Right. So was the lesson that you're like, you need both? It's the craft has to be there because if the substance isn't there, it doesn't matter. But also, if nobody knows what you do exists, that doesn't matter either. So you have these kind of like theatrical elements which get people's attention, but then you keep their attention with the attention that you put on the craft of what you do. Is that like the balance that you're trying to strike?
You're bringing up a really good point that isn't brought up often enough. So I mentioned 9 books. In my 7th book, titled Aspire, How to Create Your Own Reality and Alter Your DNA. It's my only mindset book. 25 chapters, 5 sections. There's a chapter in there that is titled Healthy Ego. Okay, so if we had all the time in the world, and I'd sit here and talk to you about self-esteem, you'd really tune in because self-esteem is supposed to be a great. The minute I reference the word ego, it's villainized.
Yeah.
3 things. You just referenced them. You didn't know you referenced. Healthy ego is the following 3 things: having an otherworldly burning passion for your purpose. In other words, being a real estate artist. I burn, I bleed, I sizzle, passion for it. Check off that box. Believing you're one of the best in the world at what you do. Like you're a great podcast host. You're one of the best. Joe Rogan, whoever might be bigger or better, there's better than I am. But I know I'm one of the best.
Yeah.
And 3, and this is the one you referenced, not being afraid to tell the world about it. Most people, if they're lucky enough to have that otherworldly burning passion for their purpose, real estate, and believing kind of half-heartedly that they're one of the best in the world at it, won't tell the world about it. Well, guess what? I need to be my own megaphone. You need to be your own megaphone, your own ringmaster, your own carnival barker, your own P.T. Barnum, because your house ain't going to talk for you. I'm Frank, you're Dan. We're not Apple, we're not Coke, we're not Kleenex, we're not NVIDIA. Those brands speak for themselves. We have to be the mouthpiece for our brand. So I realize that if I don't do that, I'm not eating at Ruth Chris Steakhouse. I'm eating out of a freaking dumpster. So I had to draw attention to our house.
Man, I always say this, like this podcast is so interesting because people come on and you never really know what you're going to talk about. This always ends up being something that feels like it's talking directly to me about my whole life.
Hey guys, hope you enjoyed part 1 of this episode. It's just too good to limit to one show. Join us next week to hear the rest.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.